My name's Al Forrester, and I'm the CEO of FICast Data Corporation. And today, I'd like to spend some time talking with you about interest rate risk management and what we at FICast believe are the requirements for a solid foundation for interest rate risk management. And then also the ultimate objective, enterprise risk management, and how interest rate risk management fits into the enterprise risk management process. I want to spend some time talking about the history of interest rate risk management and then move on to what I think are 6 critical questions related to how you effectively manage risk, and not just interest rate risk, but any type of risk. Then I'd like to discuss the difference between planning and the risk management process, and they're oftentimes at odds with each other and oftentimes get blended together. So it's very important to understand what a planning process is and what a risk management process is. And then I'd like to emphasize the importance of stress testing, because this, I think, is the centerpiece of what the regulators are asking us to do with respect to risk. And then we want to touch on the question of how it is that we actually present information to both the board and management. And we at FICast believe that an interactive visualization process is the best way to present the results of our analysis. And then finally, from the standpoint of enterprise risk management, how is it that we incorporate all 3 types of financial risk, interest rate risk, credit risk, and liquidity risk, into one enterprise risk management system? So from the standpoint of the history of interest rate risk management, I think it's important to point out that the year 2010 was pivotal, extremely important. That's the year that the FFIC issued its advisory on interest rate risk management, and it was widely publicized and created quite a stir amongst the banks. And the essential thing that the advisory communicated was that interest rate risk was very, very important, and banks needed to pay attention. Prior to that, a lot of banks simply had the attitude about interest rate risk management that said, well, interest rate risk management, so what, who cares? Well, after the advisory, the tone has changed, and the regulators are really saying, well, you better care about interest rate risk management, or else there are going to be consequences if you don't. So here's perhaps what I think is one of the most significant statements in the advisory. And it says essentially that material weakness in risk management processes or high levels of interest rate risk exposure relative to capital, translation, economic value of equity, are going to require corrective action. So what are they going to make you do? They're going to require you to raise additional capital, reduce levels of exposure, strengthen management expertise, and improve management information and measurement systems. Particularly those first 2 can be very, very costly, and in many cases the cure could be worse than the disease itself. What about before 2010? In 1996, the regulators made this statement: banks that are found to have high levels of exposure or weak management practices will be directed by the agencies to take corrective action. Such actions will include directives to raise capital, strengthen management expertise, improve management information systems, and reduce levels of exposure, or a combination thereof. So essentially, what's the difference between this statement and the one in 2010? Well, nothing. Those 2 statements are basically the same. However, practically speaking, everything has changed, because now the regulators mean what they're saying. Management and board actually have to understand interest rate risk management. The days when you could simply, hand the regulators your interest rate risk report that you got from your bond salesman are over. Understanding is critical. And the regulators are concerned about capital, economic value of equity. They're concerned about the robustness of your institution. So here are the 6 questions that I think are most critical in terms of understanding and managing risk. The first question is, what is my risk? And so in interest rate risk management, we have this chart, a graph that we typically show that illustrates your risk profile. How does your capital, or how do your earnings change when rates go up or down? And it's demonstrated graphically. And this is our visualization of what we believe our risk to be in different interest rate environments. Well, the next thing that the regulators are going to want to know, and which is a very important question in risk management, is okay, that's your risk, but what's causing it? Why does your risk profile look like that? Is there something in your balance sheet that makes you sensitive to rising or declining rates? Why does it look like that? Next, what kind of material or significant assumptions are you making in your model? Next, where did you get those assumptions? Did you just make them up out of thin air? Are they grounded in your institution's experience? Did they come from some third party? And the right answer is they need to be grounded in your experience. What happens if you're wrong about those assumptions? Those are your critical assumptions. What happens if they don't materialize? How does that affect your risk profile? And then finally, if those assumptions don't materialize, if you're wrong about them and you get into trouble from an interest rate risk standpoint, what are you going to do about it? What's your plan? And so you can see that this whole flow of managing risk moves from an understanding of what your risk is or belief to what's causing it, to what are the material assumptions, and what happens if you're wrong about those assumptions, and then finally, what is your plan, or how do you plan to address that situation if things go awry? So we want to make this distinction, as I mentioned, between planning and risk management. So when we think of planning, we when we ask the question, what is planning? Planning is, what I think is going to happen. This is what I want to happen, what I believe will happen, and in some cases, what better happen if I want to keep my job. But planning is inherently a belief system about what you think you're going to be able to achieve or do. Risk, on the other hand, is what happens if you're wrong. What happens if your plan doesn't materialize? What happens if what you believe about your risk profile doesn't materialize? What happens what are the causes? What things could cause me to blow up? Or when under what circumstances would my institution collapse uh, with regard to a particular type of risk? And of course, the truth is you have to do both. You have to plan and you have to manage risk, and there's often a trade-off between the two. In many cases, you have to sacrifice earnings that you would otherwise plan to make in order to mitigate your risk. Planning is essentially educated guessing about what's going to happen in the future. And risk management then is applying a stress testing procedure to your guessing. So what does the advisory say about stress testing? Well, the advisory says that stress testing should include a sensitivity analysis to help determine which assumptions have the most critical influence on model output. And stress testing can be used to determine the conditions under which business assumptions and model parameters break down. So those are essentially the questions that we asked earlier. And stress testing, we believe, is the heart of risk management because stress testing answers these three questions. What happens if I'm wrong? What is it that causes me to blow up? And when and under what circumstances do I collapse? So how do you stress test? Well, in order to stress test, the first thing you have to recognize is that there are two ingredients in every risk model. And those ingredients are facts and assumptions. And you have to make a distinction between the two. So when we talk about facts in an interest rate risk model, what are we talking about? We're talking about contractual facts. Here is a loan, for example. It has a particular balance. It's got a certain rate. It has certain repricing characteristics. It's tied to prime. It adjusts quarterly, etc. It has certain payment characteristics. It has a monthly payment frequency, for example. Those are contractual facts, and that's what we mean by facts in a model. What about assumptions? What are assumptions? Well, those are the things that are made up, things that you make up and put into the model, and you mix together and combine with your facts. So what are those things? Rate scenarios. We make those up. We make up different levels and different types of rate scenarios to test our balance sheet risk. We also make up non-maturity deposits. We make up maturity information for instruments that have no maturity. We make up rate sensitivity for deposit instruments that have no defined rate sensitivity. And that is an extremely important assumption, as you'll see in a little bit. Prepayments, those are also things that are made up. We put in assumptions about how we believe our customers are going to behave in terms of prepayments in different interest rate scenarios. So assumptions then are part of this planning process because they are made up. They are what I believe is going to happen. They are how I believe my customers are going to respond. And so we've blended in an element of the planning process into the risk management process. And so that means that this risk profile that you have created is not some sort of scientific fact, but rather it's a belief system. So in order to stress test, the first thing we have to do is determine which of those assumptions are most critical. Once we identify the critical assumptions, then we stress test the critical assumptions. Now, management and board are required to understand risk, and they're required to understand which assumptions are most critical. And so how do you communicate that information to your management? We believe that the utilization of interactive dashboards and graphic visualization is very critical. Graphics can communicate things that instantly that are very difficult to communicate with charts and tables and just mounds of data, pages of data. So how do we incorporate that type of analysis in interest rate risk management? How do we expose the underlying components of our risk in such a way that we really communicate what is most important? Well, we begin our process of understanding risk by essentially decomposing it. And to do that, we start out by taking a balance sheet and stripping out all of the optionality. So we start with a bank and we take out all caps and all floors, all calls and all puts. We take out all prepayment assumptions. And we introduce a liquidity nightmare where non-maturity deposits immediately cash flow and immediately are rate sensitive. And so if we have that type of model, which we call our core risk position, what we notice is that in the base rate environment, our economic value, which is signified by the 0 on the x-axis, we notice that the bank has a little over 15 million in economic value. When rates move up to 300 basis points, however, and the plus 300 bar shows that our economic value has now declined to just a little over 5 million. So that's a pretty extreme level of volatility. Now, how does that chart change? How does the model change when we add back our assumptions about options? When we add back caps and floors and calls and puts, how does our risk profile change? That's signified by the red bars. So what we notice is that the caps and floors and calls and puts, once we add those back into the model, don't effectively change the risk profile of the bank much at all. So there's some benefit in declining rates to, you'll notice, some protection related to the floors, but by and large, essentially there's no change in the risk profile. So assumptions about options, calls and puts and caps and floors are not significant for this bank. What about prepayments? When we go from no prepayments to what the bank believes based on its history its prepayment assumptions are. How do those prepayment assumptions affect the bank's risk profile? Well, it softens the profile somewhat, making it a little less volatile, but essentially it's still the same liability sensitive risk profile, where they lose significant amounts of value when rates rise. So next we add what perhaps is the most significant set of assumptions, the bank's belief system about its non-maturity deposits. This particular bank believes that its non-maturity deposits have a 5-year duration. They also believe that their money market accounts follow, which are the by far the largest portion of their non-maturity deposits, follow a 75% beta, meaning that if the Fed raises rates 100 basis points, they're going to raise their money markets by 75. So when we add these assumptions into the model about non-maturity deposits, notice how the risk profile is completely flattened out. Notice that the non-maturity deposit assumptions make the biggest difference in what the bank believes about its risk. So the yellow bars signify how all of the assumptions together uh, affect the bank's perception of its risk, and the non-maturity deposits assumptions making the most significant uh, contribution to that view of the bank's risk. We also might want to know what's causing the risk in the balance sheet. We'll notice here in the blue chart, here's the in terms of which particular instruments may be causing volatility. We can see here in the blue bars represent the asset volatility. So let's kind of drill down into the asset volatility and notice that the investments have the greatest volatility. On the bottom chart, you'll see they decline most in value when rates rise. And if you look at the investments, we'll see that mortgage backs and CMOs are the things that are contributing most to the bank's volatility. So essentially, if we wanted to eliminate some of that risk to rising rates, we might go in and shorten the mortgage-backed position because we can see that that's contributing significantly to the bank's interest rate risk. In terms of an enterprise risk management process, what we want to try to do is build a process that theoretically encompasses all types of risk. Essentially, it must, most importantly, incorporate the three most significant types of financial risk that a bank faces. And those are credit risk, liquidity risk, and interest rate risk. And all these components of risk need to be combined to show how they affect capital. Here is an example of an ERM stress test. Notice across the table below that we have different interest rate environments. We have the up and down 1, 2, and 3, 4. We have yield curve rotations, and we show the Tier 1 capital of the bank under those different scenarios, which of course is the same. Now, the first stress that we apply to it is interest rate risk itself. We incorporate the economic value gains and losses into our capital position in all these various interest rate scenarios. Notice that when rates go down, that would improve our capital position. When rates go up, that would tend to hurt our capital position. The next thing that we do is we apply in the model a level of credit stress, and we identified in this case 4% of the loans that would move into non-accrual and result in a $3 million hit to equity across the board. And moving those loans into non-accrual will also impact the forecasted retained earnings and the capital position a year from now. Then we said, from a liquidity risk standpoint, what happens if 50% of our deposit base runs off and we have to fund at wholesale rates? Well, that means that 50% of our deposit premiums go away, and that affects our capital immediately, and that's what's reflected in the liquidity risk line. But that also impacts the retained earnings for the next upcoming year, and so you can see how the combined impact of retained earnings from both credit risk and liquidity risk results in different retained earnings for different rate environments. And so what you have then at the total equity line is, what is my total capital position 1 year forward, incorporating all of these three things: interest rate risk, credit risk, and liquidity risk, and what kind of capital ratios fall out of that. You'll see I've got a target of 8% capital assets, and that when rates go up 1, 2, and 3, my capital ratios decline below my target level of capital assets. You'll also notice that my earnings, however, improve under those environments, and so you can see what's highlighted there is sometimes the disagreement between the regulators and between management. Management prefers the earnings in that environment, but the regulators would be opposed to it because of the diminished capital position. But that is an example of how to combine all three types of risk into one ERM stress test. So in conclusion, just to sum up the things that we've covered here, you need to be aware that regulators are very serious about the risk management process, and that you're required, both you and your board are required to understand what your risk is. Be aware that planning and risk management processes are different, but yet sometimes the risk management process is commingled with the planning process. You need to understand how that's happening. And because it's commingled, the risk profile is a belief system, which means that your risk profile is made up of both facts but also assumptions, things that you believe are going to happen, which is, again, part of the planning process. Assumptions are things that are made up. And when you make up your assumptions, particularly about non-maturity deposits and prepayments, they need to be the best guess possible. They need to be based on your history, not on third-party assumptions. But recognize then that those are still assumptions no matter how good the guesses are, and you have to understand the significance of each assumption and which ones are most critical. And then you have to stress test those critical assumptions to determine what happens to you if you're wrong. Finally, the results of the analysis need to be communicated both visually and interactively so that they can most easily be understood by board and management. And then last of all, your enterprise risk management system needs to incorporate all three types of financial risk and show how those combine to affect the bank's capital. Thank you for your time.